Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
My sister announced the idea like it was weather and not my life, with that airy voice she saves for news she knows will burn and a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. Telling our parents she was planning a surprise party for her boyfriend and that it absolutely had to be on the same Saturday as my wedding because the venue had magical golden hour lighting and his friends were all in town for a conference, which sounded suspiciously convenient and just messy enough to be defended later. As an unfortunate coincidence rather than the routine collision it really was, since Sophie has a long history of landing squarely on other people's milestones and calling it fate. I sat there with my binder of timelines and place cards and playlists, the one I started when Noah proposed with a ring that fit only after I stopped shaking, and I waited for my parents to laugh and say the obvious thing that grown adults with intact spines would say, which is that you don't schedule a surprise party on your sister's wedding day because you are not a season finale villain, you are family. Instead, my mother shifted her reading glasses onto her hair like a crown of plausible deniability and murmured that perhaps we could wrap our thing earlier, and my father cleared his throat and did a project manager voice about logistics and traffic and the challenge of getting to both events. At which point the absurdity curled through me like smoke, and I realized that my parents were fully prepared to treat my vows like a brunch reservation you try to make before the ballgame. Noah, who can lower my blood pressure by making eye contact, slid his hand over mine and said in that steady way he has that we should choose the part of the day that matters most and protect it with everything we have. Which is how I found myself at the courthouse that morning with a borrowed pen and a bouquet wrapped in a rubber band, whispering promises to the man who has seen me ugly cry over lost luggage and still looks at me like I am a sunrise he gets to keep, while a clerk stamped paper. That made our little world official, a small ceremony made dignified not by witnesses or chandeliers, but by the quiet thrill of refusing to let disrespect decide the shape of our happiest moment. When we stepped back into the daylight, my phone hummed with messages that tried very hard to be neutral about the schedule, the tone like a careful tap dance across a minefield, and I felt something stubborn and oddly light rise up in me. The part that believes in justice, but also enjoys a cleanly executed checkmate, so I called the caterer and explained that our reception would not be happening as planned and asked whether our fully paid menu could still be prepared and delivered to the community shelter that had been begging for a weekend dinner sponsor, and when the coordinator agreed with a startled kindness, I asked if the printed cards and the thank you banner could carry my sister's name. Because after all she had campaigned so hard for the evening spotlight, and it felt only fair to let her enjoy the glow that comes from feeding people who rarely get a second plate. By the time my parents finished taking selfies in the parking lot outside Sophie's rented lounge, just a quick snap before Ethan arrives, "We're so proud of you both. We'll try to make it to the last hour of your reception, sweetheart." The shelter dining room had the chafing dishes lined up like a parade, the roasted chicken steaming and the mashed potatoes holding swirls like soft sculptures, and the banner strung across the far wall in large neat letters that said, "With gratitude to Sophie Bennett for tonight's meal," which the director loved so much she asked the volunteer who runs their Facebook page to share a photo and tag the family, and I nodded and said of course. Because generosity deserves an audience even when it is misattributed with great enthusiasm. I would be lying if I said I did not savor the delicate click of the first notification or the second, or the chorus that followed when neighbors and old teachers and casual acquaintances began to comment with an avalanche of heart-heavy praise about what a beautiful soul my sister must be to donate a wedding feast on her sister's special day. The irony so thick you could spread it on toast, while I sat on our sofa in an absurdly expensive dress I had bought on sale and let Noah rest his head on my shoulder as we shared a takeout burger because we were starving and happy and also a little wrecked, which is a flavor of joy that tastes like relief with a hard edge. My parents did not see the post immediately because they were supervising a confetti cannon and approving the playlist and telling themselves that grown children do not need hand-holding. And Sophie did not see it at first because she was backstage coaching her friends through the big surprise. But the universe has a sense of timing that would make a screenwriter jealous, so the photo of the shelter's dining room, full of smiling faces beneath that banner with her name, landed in our family Group chat exactly as Ethan finished his first thank you, a cheerful toast captured on 3 phones at once, and the chat erupted with overlapping bubbles of "This is incredible" and "Sophie, I had no idea you organized that" and "Your heart is something else," which echoed around the room like a second soundtrack. I could tell the moment Sophie finally looked down and registered the praise, because even in a still image you can recognize the microsecond where a person calculates the cost of correcting a flattering misunderstanding. And my sister is quick with math when it benefits her, so she lifted her glass higher and let the moment roll, while my mother typed a breezy, "We are beyond proud of you both today." And my father added a thumbs up emoji he thinks reads as youthful when it really reads as abdication. Meanwhile, I sent nothing, because silence can be a scalpel when used with intention, and I wanted the picture to do the work. Noah squeezed my knee and asked, very softly, whether I felt better or worse, and I told him the truth, which is that I felt both in a way that made my bones hum, and then my phone buzzed again with a new message. Not from the group chat, but from an unknown number that contained a single image of that same shelter photo, except this one had a different angle and a visible reflection in the window glass. A small caught silhouette that looked a lot like someone we both knew standing near the banner with his hands in his pockets, and the caption under it was only a question mark, which sat there blinking at me like a dare while the cheers swelled on Sophie's side of town and the courthouse ink on my name had just begun to dry. By the time the last confetti streamer stuck to the bottom of someone's shoe and the surprise playlist slid into those late evening songs that make people sway in doorways while pretending they are not calculating exits, the comments had multiplied into a soft avalanche under the shelter photo, and the story of my sister's astonishing generosity had already migrated from Facebook to the neighborhood group, to the PTA chat where rival mothers suddenly discovered a deep appreciation for philanthropic coordination, to the church bulletin's weekend recap where the deacon's wife, who has never remembered my name, typed out a glowing paragraph about the power of servant leadership and the witness of selfless timing, which might have made me laugh if I had not still been wearing wedding lipstick in a living room that smelled like takeout onions and adrenaline. When my parents finally called, their voices wore that brittle shine people use when they haven't decided whether to scold you or recruit you, and they opened with questions that sounded like statements along the lines of, "Sweetheart, we had no idea you were feeling this hurt, and you know Sophie didn't mean anything by the scheduling overlap," followed by a careful suggestion that I could still salvage the reception if I were to embrace the comedy of errors and come by for a quick family toast, which told me everything about the hierarchy in their heads and nothing about the contents of their hearts. Sophie texted in the voice she uses when public opinion is a bouquet she intends to keep watered, a long paragraph that began with, "I am genuinely touched by how people are responding to tonight. And I absolutely would have told them the donation came from you if I had seen it in time, but since the comments were already moving and I didn't want to embarrass you, I let it ride, because I know you hate attention and prefer to be low-key," which was such an elegant inversion of the truth that I had to sit very still to keep the room from spinning, while Noah, who has a black belt in restraint, walked to the kitchen and returned with 2 waters as if hydration could anchor integrity. The unknown number's image with the window reflection kept humming at the edge of my mind like a neon sign you cannot quite read from across the street, and I scrolled up and down the anonymous text thread looking for a clue I knew was not there, because the sender had offered only the photograph and the question mark, which felt less like a threat than a test, as though someone wanted to know whether I would recognize the outline of a man who looked suspiciously like my father standing off to the side of a banner he did not fund, hands tucked into his pockets the way he does when he has agreed to something he knows he should have stopped, the posture of a spectator in a play where his daughter is the understudy to the role of herself. I did not reply to Sophie's performance of concern or my mother's breezy pivot toward reconciliation theater, and instead, I recorded a calm video at our kitchen table where the flowers had started to wilt into a version of their true shapes, speaking directly and evenly to the friends who had booked flights and bought dresses and offered to build playlists, explaining that Noah and I had chosen to marry that morning because we liked the idea of promising each other in a room without an audience. that we had redirected the reception to the shelter because plates of hot food matter more than canceled contracts, and that we were grateful beyond words for the vendors who tried to bend time for us. Then, in the same breath, I listed every caterer, florist, band, and photographer by name, thanked them for their patience, and said that any deposits we could not ethically reclaim would be released to couples on the vendor waitlists whose budgets could use a miracle, which I asked the vendors to confirm publicly so recipients could plan without fear, a tiny economy of grace that cost me less than pride, but bought me an hour of quiet sleep. I posted the video without fanfare and attached the vendor list like a grocery note on a fridge, and because the internet loves receipts, within minutes the florist reposted with 3 stunned heart paragraphs about faith in clients. The band announced they had booked a senior center dance the following afternoon courtesy of our release, and the photographer wrote something incandescent about second chances, which gathered into a chorus that hummed beneath my sister's trending halo and politely tugged the spotlight in a different direction. Someone on the PTA chat pasted the vendor confirmations under the shelter photo with a caption about how to turn a mess into a map, and another person added, almost as a footnote, that it was awfully generous of Sophie to coordinate such a thing when she must have been busy with balloons, which would have been farcical if it were not so perfectly symmetrical to the way our family had always worked, with me doing the dishes while Sophie arranged the centerpiece and accepted compliments for the shine. When my parents called again, the brittle shine was gone, and in its place was a cautious curiosity, a tone I have rarely heard from them directed at me. And my father started to ask a question he did not finish about the origin of the shelter banner, and whether there might have been a more accurate way to handle attribution before my mother, sensing the ground shift, cleared her throat and invited us to swing by after all for a late-night dessert and a quick group photo for the family album, which might have been an olive branch if olives did not taste like brine. I told them the truth, that we were home, that we were tired, that we had married in a way I would not trade for 100 chandeliers, and that I needed them to hear me say I would not be making my life smaller so someone else's could look larger, a sentence that landed with the quiet thud of a door closed gently rather than slammed. Noah fell asleep on the sofa with his hand still around mine, and I sat in the half-light replaying the day like an editor searching for a missing frame, wondering whether the silhouette in the shelter window was my father or a trick of glass. Whether the person who sent the photo wanted to warn me or provoke me, whether restraint is a form of power or a mask for fear. When my phone vibrated again and a voicemail rolled in from a number I did recognize this time, carrying the slow sandpaper voice of Aunt Ruth asking if I could meet her for coffee tomorrow morning alone, because she had been thinking about vows and guests and who stands where when the music starts, and she had something she wanted to say while it was still early enough to choose the ending. Aunt Ruth picked the corner table at the bakery that still smells like butter and sugar even when the ovens are sleeping. The kind of place where people pretend croissants are personality traits, and where she has been quietly watching this town behave like a small stage for longer than I have been alive. And as soon as I sat down, she reached across the table with those careful hands that have fixed hems and pie crusts and family legends, holding my fingers the way you hold a thread you are about to pull, and said that she had been awake most of the night thinking about the arithmetic of love and loyalty, about who shows up when the sky cracks and who arrives only for the rainbow selfie, and about how vows say as much about the witnesses as they do about the couple, which landed in my chest like a bell struck by someone who knows where the metal is thinnest. She asked for a simple retelling of the week without the performance. No Instagram gloss, no martyr monologues, just the order of events and the choices we made. So I told her about the double booking, the courthouse flowers still cinched by a rubber band, the redirected trays of roasted chicken lined up under that unintended tribute, and the vendor deposits we converted into small parachutes for strangers, while she stirred her coffee with a slow patience that felt like note-taking without paper. And when I finished, she nodded the way Aunt Ruth nods at a garment that will wear well for years, not because it is flashy, but because the seams were cut with sense. She did not ask about Sophie's motives or my parents' calculations, which I appreciated more than I can say, because curiosity is a form of dignity when applied properly, and instead she asked about Noah. how he carried the day on his face and in his shoulders, and I told her the truth that he looks calm, but he holds his breath when my mother calls, and that he keeps a shoebox of letters he wrote to them after old arguments and never mailed. Not because he is weak, but because he understands that sending them would scratch an itch and start a fire at the same time, and she smiled with a depth that made me wonder if she had her own box somewhere, possibly tied with kitchen twine next to the recipes she never shares in full. When I tried to apologize for the public awkwardness, for the optics of a wedding that turned into a lesson plan on consequences, she set her spoon down with the care of a surgeon and told me that I had done something most families fail at until it is too late. I had labeled the jar before filling it, which meant that whatever came next could not be mistaken for something else, and that clarity is an inheritance worth more than land. A sentence that felt like a thrown rope I had not realized I needed until my palms were already around it. Then, with the same unhurried tone, she mentioned that she and Uncle Dan had been reviewing documents, because life is a long road with shorter exits than anyone admits, and that there are practical questions about who keeps keys and who knows which doors are worth locking. I said I did not want money to buy me the family I could not seem to reach without a ticket, and she laughed softly and said that money has never bought a family, but it has certainly rented a lot of bad theater. And then she changed the subject as easily as slipping a stitch, asking whether there were friends who had been sidelined by my parents' guest list because their definition of important enough has always been a little allergic to people without a glossy finish, which is how I found myself that afternoon hosting a make-good brunch in our tiny backyard with folding tables and leftover centerpieces that looked better in daylight, inviting the neighbors who once babysat me for free, the librarian who saved my favorite book during a budget cut, the art teacher who never made a program but made me brave, and two uncles my mother calls a handful who, it turns out, can grill better than most professionals when given the dignity of tongs. I told them I could not offer the string quartet or the synchronized sparklers because those had been traded for midnight soup at the shelter, but I could offer a long table and real thanks, and that we would be funding, in Aunt Ruth's maiden name, a small annual scholarship through the Community Foundation for a student who volunteers at the shelter or the senior center, not because philanthropy photographs well, but because it translates chaos into groceries, and the way the room breathed at that announcement felt like the opposite of a performance, a quiet recognition that sometimes revenge is not a dagger, but a ledger balanced in public where anyone can audit the math. Late in the afternoon, while Noah refilled lemonade and Aunt Ruth sat laughing with the librarian about card catalogs that used to squeak, my phone began to vibrate with a frequency that suggested a fire alarm or a market crash. And the first message I opened contained the kind of sentence you do not expect to read standing under a string of mismatched bunting, a crisp note from a cousin who works with someone's attorney who golfs with Uncle Dan, saying that word around the club is that Aunt Ruth and Uncle Dan plan to leave everything to me because I understand stewardship, which is the sort of rumor that does not arise from thin air and does not land without shattering glass. Within minutes, my parents' names lit up the screen with repeated calls and a single text from my mother that read, "We need to talk now before this gets out of hand," while the last call I let ring out came from Sophie, who wrote, "Please tell me this isn't true, because if it is, we need to plan something big to fix the optics," and I stood there with a plate of potato salad in my hand and the sound of perfectly ordinary laughter braided with the vibration of dysfunction, realizing that a story I had tried to keep small had just cracked open into something none of us could fold back into the drawer, and that the only question left was whose hands would be visible on the lid when it finally closed. When rumors evolve into headlines whispered in kitchens and boardrooms alike, the people who once ignored you suddenly rehearse new languages of affection, and by the middle of that week my parents were leaving voicemails heavy with strained cheer. The kind of messages that insist nothing has changed while every syllable begs for confirmation that everything has, telling me they were thinking it would be wonderful to stage a second ceremony now that things had settled, a polite fiction to cover the fact that nothing about our family had ever settled except their willingness to overlook imbalance when it suited the golden child narrative. Sophie, predictably, went into strategy mode, suggesting a redo shower that she claimed would mend perceptions and secure brand sponsorships because she has never met a public gesture she could not monetize. And my parents nodded along with her proposals like attendees at a seminar they didn't dare question, the three of them designing a theater of reconciliation where I would be expected to play both the grateful daughter and the compliant understudy to my sister's spotlight. Noah listened to all this with that low, skeptical silence he uses when deciding whether it is better to laugh or leave, and eventually asked me one evening at the kitchen counter what I would actually want if I stripped away their noise. A question I had avoided for weeks because the truth is that what I wanted most was impossible, the version of parents who would have chosen me first on the day that mattered most, and since I could not summon that miracle, I decided instead to lean into a different kind of power, the kind that makes demands not of apologies but of proof. So I told them we would consider a second ceremony under one condition: attendance required receipts. Literal slips of paper or electronic confirmations showing volunteer hours at the shelter, the senior center, or the food pantry, or donations made without expectation of a plaque. Because if they wanted to sit under chandeliers and clap at vows, then they would need to prove they had lifted more than champagne flutes. The silence that followed was both delicious and dangerous, because for once my parents did not have a script ready, and my sister sputtered about sponsors and optics and how corporations do not write checks for service hours, as if marriage were a campaign you could brand with a hashtag, while my father tried to reframe the requirement as a clever gimmick to draw attention to worthy causes, missing entirely that it was no gimmick but a boundary carved in stone. Yet the idea caught fire outside the family circle, because when I shared it with friends they responded with a kind of giddy respect. And soon local acquaintances were posting about how refreshing it was to see someone invert the usual guest list snobbery into a guest list built on effort, which made my parents' resistance look less like concern for propriety and more like terror of being seen as the empty chairs they often were. The weeks that followed were a study in unraveling masks. Sophie tried to stage a parallel event with sponsored decorations that fell apart when not enough brands wanted to back a party requiring actual labor. My parents oscillated between reluctant sign-ups for volunteer shifts and bitter complaints about the indignity of punching hours like teenagers. And Noah and I kept quietly preparing a day that would be less about spectacle than about watching who showed up sweaty and who showed up polished, because there is no algorithm that disguises the smell of genuine work. On the morning of what we called, half-jokingly, our vow renewal, cars began to pull up outside the community center with people carrying donation slips, volunteer hour logs, and even boxes of canned goods, because some had missed the deadline but refused to arrive empty-handed, and the sight of all those small proofs stacked up on the check-in table felt better than any gift registry could have. Inside, the tables were simple, the flowers cut from backyards, the chairs unevenly matched, but the atmosphere was thick with a kind of pride that cannot be rented, and when Noah and I stood to repeat our promises I could feel the difference in the room. Because these were witnesses who had already lifted, scrubbed, served, or written checks, and they clapped with calloused hands instead of manicured expectations. My parents sat stiffly in the second row, their volunteer receipts visible like bandages no one quite believes in, and Sophie looked restless, whispering to a friend that she could have booked a venue with better lighting, unaware that someone nearby was recording her irritation in the same way people record birdsong, because it will be replayed later as evidence of a season's truth. After the brief ceremony, we transitioned into what we had promised, a community meal cooked and served by the very guests who had earned their seats, with Aunt Ruth perched at a corner table watching the rhythm like a conductor, smiling at me with that subtle pride that feels like a transfer of authority. Yet, even as I helped stack plates and Noah carried trays, I noticed Aunt Ruth beckon me quietly, her voice low as she asked if I had brought the wedding album, which made my throat tighten because of course there was no album. Just scattered photos and videos from phones and courthouse signatures on paper, but the way she asked suggested that she wasn't requesting pictures at all, but rather testing whether I understood the difference between staged memory and lived inheritance. When I admitted softly that there was no album, only evidence spread across devices and rumors, She nodded as though I had confirmed what she already knew, and told me not to worry because the record that matters most is who shows up and who stays, which she has been writing in her head for years. Then, almost as an afterthought but weighted with something sharp, she said that one day soon decisions would have to be signed and sealed, and that when that moment arrived she needed to be absolutely sure I would not mistake money for forgiveness. Because inheritance can close wounds or salt them, depending on the hand that holds it. Her words lingered through the clatter of dishes and the laughter of neighbors who felt included for once, and while I smiled and thanked and poured lemonade, my chest carried the heavy knowledge that she was warning me about a choice that would not be as simple as hosting brunch or redirecting catering, but about how to wield a kind of authority that makes families beg, kneel, or vanish. And as we walked home under streetlights that hummed like tired bees, Noah carrying the leftover flowers and me clutching the box of receipts like a strange dowry, I could not shake the image of an empty album waiting to be filled, not with photos, but with names, decisions, and signatures that would define who still belonged at our table when the lights finally went out. By the time the rumor hardened into fact and my parents realized that the inheritance they had always assumed would circle back to Sophie like a homing pigeon was instead written with my name in ink that did not smudge, they appeared on my doorstep with expressions that blended panic and performance, asking if we could reset the narrative by planning one more wedding celebration, something more traditional, where they could stand beside me in photographs that would outlive apologies and spin a story they had not earned. And while I listened to them outline their vision of redemption dressed as etiquette, I could see Noah in the corner of the room setting down the shoebox of letters he had kept for years. A quiet signal that words withheld can be as heavy as words spoken, and that perhaps it was time to let the truth breathe. The letters, written in his measured handwriting across years of family disappointments, contained every defense of me he had ever swallowed back in order to keep the peace, and though he had never sent them. He placed the box on the table between us, as if to remind all of us that silence has a cost, one they had never considered while trading my milestones for Sophie's applause. My father tried to ignore it, focusing instead on logistics of venues and guest lists, speaking in the same project manager cadence he had used when explaining why they could only attend part of my original wedding day, while my mother dabbed at the corner of her eye as if a tear might summon forgiveness through sympathy rather than change. But Aunt Ruth's words from the week before pressed against my ribs, reminding me that inheritance is not a trophy, it is a test. And that how I handled this moment would write a record longer than any album. I thought about the silhouette in the shelter window, about the anonymous photo that had arrived with a question mark, about the reflection of a man who might have been my father standing with his hands in his pockets while others celebrated a generosity he had not contributed to, and I wondered if the person who had sent it wanted me to see more than just complicity. Perhaps to understand that witnesses matter, that absence is as visible as presence, and that families leave fingerprints on betrayal whether they admit it or not. I also thought about Sophie's restless whispering at the vow renewal, about her desperate attempts to twist every consequence into an opportunity for sponsorship, and about how even now she was probably drafting a plan to leverage the inheritance news into her own form of visibility, the kind that thrives not on truth but on spotlight. So I told them, calmly but without room for negotiation, that there would be no third ceremony designed to launder old mistakes into glossy photographs, because my marriage was not a stage set they could rent for reputation repair, but there would be something else. Something different, and that if they truly wanted to be included they would need to decide whether they were willing to show up without choreography. Then I invited them, along with anyone else who claimed to love me, to attend a gathering that weekend in our backyard, not a wedding, not a renewal, not even a formal party, but a day of community service in honor of Aunt Ruth's name, where the family table would be reserved not for last names or bloodlines, but for those who lifted, carried, scrubbed, and served, because the only legacy worth protecting is the one that feeds rather than starves. On that Saturday, the yard filled with people who had seen too many staged photographs and were hungry for something real. Neighbors carrying boxes of canned goods, cousins unloading folding chairs, friends from the shelter kitchen setting up trays of food, and children racing around with water pitchers in a kind of joy that no professional planner could choreograph. At the center table sat Aunt Ruth, her face lit not by candles or chandeliers, but by the simple pride of watching a room rearrange itself around the people who actually put in the work. Noah read aloud one of his unsent letters, a gentle but unflinching defense of me from years earlier, his voice steady as it finally reached the ears that had ignored its message when silence protected them. And the room was so quiet that even the clink of a spoon felt like punctuation. My parents sat among the crowd, their hands uncertain, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and recognition, as if they were realizing for the first time that inclusion cannot be begged, bought, or staged, it must be earned. And while Sophie lingered near the edge of the tables, her phone held like a shield, I noticed that she never once picked up a tray or poured a drink, though she smiled broadly when a neighbor snapped a picture, and I let the moment pass without correction because the record keeps itself when the truth is visible. Toward the end of the evening, when the chairs were being stacked and the tables folded away, I carried a sealed invitation to my parents' porch, a heavy envelope with their names printed above a single line that read, "Show up before you sit down." I did not stay to watch them open it, nor did I explain whether it was an invitation to another gathering, a symbolic gesture, or simply a dare, because the ambiguity was the point, a reminder that family cannot be summoned by calendar or convenience. It must be proven in the act of arriving. And as Noah and I walked home with our hands still sticky from dish soap and lemonade, I realized that I might never know whether my parents would choose to step into that blank line with both feet or whether they would retreat into the safety of their own rehearsed excuses. But what mattered most was that the decision was no longer mine to make or theirs to manipulate. In the silence that followed, I thought about Aunt Ruth's question, whether I could hold wealth without mistaking it for reconciliation. And I understood that perhaps the true inheritance was not the money or the property or the signatures waiting on a lawyer's desk, but the clarity to see who had been at the table when the food was served, and who had only ever arrived for the photographs. The ending, like the invitation, would remain unwritten until they proved otherwise, and maybe that was the most honest revenge of all, leaving them with the chance to show up or stay gone, without me carrying the weight of either choice.